Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here, and you are listening to episode 345 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. I hope you're ready because I have another really big, really awesome caliber roll-up for you today about the 7mm bore diameter. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about all of the 7mm CIP and SAAMI standardized cartridges. And as always, I'll talk about their history, their design characteristics, their performance specs, strengths and weaknesses, and their recommended uses. And where appropriate, I will also share some personal anecdotes involving these rounds, as well as some observations involving various cartridges by noteworthy gun writers as well. Among other references, I did use Ron Spomer's new book, 7mm Cartridges from Around the World, as a reference. He published this book in late 2023. I really enjoyed it. Just like the title says, it talks about all the major 7mm cartridges from around the world. I recommend picking up a copy of that book on Amazon for yourself. Link is in the show notes. I also used the book African Rifles and Cartridges by John Taylor as a reference. Same thing with the book Rifle in America by Phil Sharpe, the 17th edition of Cartridges of the World, edited by W. Todd Woodard, and Any Shot You Want by Art Alphen, and of course the Hornady, Nosler, and Lyman reloading manuals. Now, before we get started talking about all these 7mm rounds, I am giving away a set of Axle Tracker electronic earmuffs. This is a brand new in-the-box set, literally identical to what I use at the range and sometimes out hunting. The Tracker muffs provide hearing protection and hearing enhancement, so you can carry on a conversation with the person next to you at the range or hear the sounds of an approaching deer without exposing your ears to damage from gunshots or other loud noises. Sign up at thebiggamehuntingblog.com/giveaway or click the link in the show notes to be entered in a random drawing for these muffs. Be sure to confirm your email address if you are prompted to do so after you sign up. You have until 11:59 p.m. Central Time on 1 December 2024 to sign up. I will randomly select one lucky listener from all of the submissions on 2 December to receive those muffs. Now, I know you've been waiting for this episode for a long time. Ever since I published episode 286 on the 30 caliber cartridges about a year ago, I have received a constant stream of listeners asking for more episodes like that, but specifically requesting a 7mm episode. Well, here you go. Buckle up, folks, because this is going to be another good one. We'll go all the way back to the late 1800s and talk about the 7x57. This is where it all begins, both for the 7mm story and for more modern cartridge development in general. For what it's worth, the official SAAMI designation of the round is 7mm Mauser with 7x57 in parentheses. So really either one is correct. Paul Mauser designed this cartridge in 1892. It uses a rimless design with a .473-inch rim diameter, a 57mm long case, an overall length of 3.065 inches. It is a in-between round that is longer than short-action rounds like the .308, but a little bit shorter than the .30-06. Also, as is common with European cartridges, there is also a rimmed design of the 7mm Mauser they call the 7x57R that is utilized in double and single shot rifles, but it's nowhere near as popular as the rimless 7x57. This round was, of course, very popular in military use with a number of different countries. Spanish soldiers using Model 1893 quote-unquote Spanish Mauser rifles used them to great effect against American troops, to include a Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Roosevelt in the Spanish-American War, specifically at the Battle of San Juan Hill. The same thing was also true a few years later with South African Boers armed with 1893 and 1895 model Mauser rifles at Spy on Kop and some other places in modern-day South Africa against the British during the Second Boer War. This was a revolutionary cartridge back during that time frame, and the Spanish and the Boers and other countries that were utilizing those rifles and using this cartridge were on the leading edge of a revolution in military affairs and in weapons development. And they had a noted advantage over their American and British foes in these specific examples, who were using slightly older rifles and less highly developed cartridges. There were many special things about the 7x57 Mauser that really set it apart from the pack at the time. First, it was one of the very first cartridges designed from the outset to use smokeless powder. This gave it impressive ballistics compared to other cartridges of the day. Along with these attributes, the 7mm Mauser was first mass-produced in the model 1892 and 1893 Mauser bolt-action rifles, which were themselves far more advanced than comparable rifles of that time period. Featuring the revolutionary non-rotating Mauser extractor and designed to accept 5-round stripper clips to facilitate fast reloading, those Mauser rifles were accurate, reliable, easy to maintain, and facilitated a rapid rate of fire on part of the user. These are all ideal attributes for a military rifle, and soldiers equipped with these rifles could accurately engage targets at greater ranges and maintain a higher rate of fire for longer periods of time than other military rifles of the late 1800s. Indeed, the American Army was so impressed with the performance of the Mauser rifle and cartridge, they developed the 1903 Springfield and the 30-03 Springfield, which later evolved into the 30-06 a few years later. In the end, the new 1903 Springfield rifle was modeled heavily on, and some might even say copied, the Mauser rifle. The same was also true with the 30-06 cartridge itself, which bears a strong physical resemblance to the 7mm cartridge and even shares the same rimless case design and .473-inch base diameter. I would not go so far as to say the 30-06 is directly descended from the 7mm Mauser, but it was certainly heavily influenced by that round. Remember, we're talking about the late 1890s, early 1900s here. Hunters had very limited options for powerful centerfire rifle cartridges using smokeless powder and designed for use in bolt-action rifles back then. And black powder cartridges still ruled the roost, so to speak. The 30-30 Winchester came along in 1895 and was, along with the 7mm Mauser, one of the other very first cartridges designed from the start to use smokeless powder. But the 30-30 was designed for use in lever-action rifles, and it did not have nearly as long of an effective range as the 7 Mauser. Now, really, you could make a pretty strong argument that the development of both the 7mm Mauser cartridge and the Mauser rifle both started the trend away from lower pressure black powder cartridges designed for use in single shot and or lever action rifles towards more modern high-powered cartridges designed for use in bolt action rifles. And even if it didn't literally start that trend, the 7mm Mauser was certainly at the leading edge of it. Now, on the sporting side of things, hunters especially appreciated the effectiveness of the cartridge on medium-sized animals, though the cartridge has also developed something of a mystical reputation on really big, dangerous game as well. I'll read an excerpt from the book Any Shot You Want on the 7x57 Mauser. This particular section was written by Finn Agard. Nevertheless, it earned its lasting fame as a big game round. The first sporting ammunition for it offered a soft point version of the 175-grain round-nose military bullet at the same nominal 2,300 feet per second muzzle velocity. With its large exposure of lead, it expanded well, while its high sectional density, .310, and modest impact velocities ensured the long bullet retained enough weight in its shank to penetrate deeply. It proved to be a reliable killer on all manner of game, some of it quite large. The 7x57mm became popular enough that John Rigby and Company adopted it as their own, calling it the Rigby 275, named for its English bore diameter. A Rigby Mauser so chambered was the imitable W.D.M. Bell's favorite elephant thumper for his forays into the wild Karamoja region of northern Uganda early in this century. He specialized in brain shots, but killed them with body shots also. In order to get the requisite penetration, he used solids exclusively. In addition to elephant, he killed lions and many buffalo with the 7x57mm without trouble. But there was only one bell, and the animals did not react to the presence of a man as they do today. and he had no compunction about getting out of the way and letting the animal die. No experienced hunter today would condone the use of the 7mm Mauser on any dangerous game except possibly leopard. End of quote. Okay, now let's see what John Taylor had to say about the round in the book African Rifles and Cartridges. This is an even more popular and much more widely used weapon than the .256 among small bore enthusiasts. I much prefer it myself, and my little Rigby gave me the greatest possible pleasure and satisfaction. But it was usually as a small bore rifle that I used it, not as a medium bore. I do not believe in these small calibers for the bigger animals. They were widely used when they first came in, and men were beginning to realize the greatly enhanced killing power of the metal-jacketed bullet as compared with the old lead slugs. Also, the game were still comparatively unsophisticated and spent more of their time out in the open so that the hunter could pick his shot to a much greater extent than he can today. The little 7mm rifle is every bit as good a killer as the 6.5mm, and it has adequate penetration to enable it to find the vitals of any animal. This was Bell's favorite weapon, and it was with it that he killed practically all of his 1011 elephant. However, it is rarely used nowadays by regular hunters, other, of course, than as a genuine small bore for the smaller animals. The principal objection to these small calibers is that the expanding bullets cannot always be relied upon to penetrate sufficiently on the heavier kinds of game, even of the non-dangerous beasts, and therefore solids must be used. But if the little slug is not perfectly placed, little damage is done and the animal may get away. This rifle, firing its 140-grain high-velocity bullet, is widely used in British East Africa for all the general run of non-dangerous game. I cannot condemn this practice too strongly. It results in an immense number of wounded animals getting away to die miserably, or even worse, to be pulled down and literally eaten alive by hyenas or other varmints that would be unable to kill them if unwounded. End of quote. Now, aside from those two examples I just gave you, Jim Corbett also detailed multiple accounts of his using a .275 Rigby to take man-eating tigers and leopards in India in his book, The Man-Eaters of Kuman. That said, though, a leopard and even really a tiger is very different than a buffalo or an elephant or even really an eland or something along those lines in terms of size and what is necessary to kill it. It may not necessarily be the best tool for the job, but using the 7 Mauser on a cat is not really, in my mind anyway, a controversial thing to do. All in all, I'm pretty well in agreement with John Taylor and Finn Agard and those guys. I think the 7mm Mauser is right at home as a medium game cartridge. It's great on deer-sized game and similar-sized African antelope, right? Blesbok, impala, various species of gazelle, etc. I think it's perfect for them. There's no reason you can't use it on bigger game either, right? Elk, kudu, bear, whatever, especially with a good quality bullet. Now, Jack O'Connor also spoke very highly of the rifle. His wife, Eleanor, had a rifle chambered in 7mm Mauser. He also did a fair bit of hunting with that cartridge over the course of his life. He actually used one to take his very first sheep, which was a desert bighorn in Sonora in the 1930s. He never lost his love for that cartridge, and I'll quote to you the text from a plaque on a rifle display case at the Jack O'Connor Museum in Idaho. I quote, "In his book, The Big Game Rifle, Jack O'Connor describes how metalsmith Tom Burgess and stockmaker Russell Leonard built this rifle on a Czech VZ-24 action for him in 1951. Not long after, he let Eleanor try the rifle, and she claimed it for her own. With the stock shortened and a recoil pad added, she used the rifle for most of her North American and African hunting, including the taking of her award-winning Doll Ram in 1963 and a 60-inch kudu on her last safari in 1972. End of quote. There cannot be too many rifles in existence that have taken both a Boone & Crockett Doll sheep and a 60-inch kudu. That's very impressive. But there you go. Like I said, all of that is right in what I would consider to be a conventional use of the 7mm Mauser and the shortcomings of the cartridge, if you can even really say this is a major shortcoming. It's not going to affect too many people, is that this is a lower velocity round that is not very flat shooting, and it's not a great long range cartridge. But that's not what most people need it for or use it for anyway. SAAMI maximum average pressure for the 7 Mauser is 51,000 psi or 46,000 CUP. The European CIP specs for the cartridge are similar, 56,565 psi. The 7x57R, once again, this is the rimmed version of the cartridge, is loaded to a little bit lower pressure of 49,313 psi. There is no SAAMI rating for the 7x57R. But Hornady says in their reloading handbook to reduce max loads by 10 to 15% if you are using those loads in a rifle chambered in 7x57R. Now, the cartridge has a lower overall, and I'm talking about the rimless 7x57, has a lower overall pressure rating due to the number of old Remington rolling block rifles still out there. You could potentially make a spicier hand load for use in a rifle with a strong action. Do this at your own risk, though. And the 7x57 is the parent case to the 6mm Remington and the 257 Roberts. And like I said, it's possibly the parent to the whole 30-06 family, but if it's not really literally the parent to the 30-06, it is darn similar. Several different companies make several different factory loads for the cartridge right now. Federal makes one 140 grain power shock at 2,660 feet per second for 2,200 foot-pounds of energy. They also make a 175 grain loading using a round nose bullet, also in their power shock line at 2,390 feet per second for also just over 2,200 foot-pounds of energy. Nosler makes a load with 140 grain E-tip at 2,700 feet per second. Also 140 grain AccuBond at the same velocity. Remington has a load with 140 grain core lock at 2660. Winchester makes a load with a 145 grain PowerPoint, also at 2660. PPU makes a load with 139 grain soft point at 2660. Seller and Balat makes a couple of loads with bullets ranging from 140 to 175 grains. They also, S&B also makes a few 7x57R factory loads too. A 140 at 2650 and a 175 grain bullet at 2411. So pretty similar specs actually for both of those loads from S&B for the 7x57 rimless and rimmed. So, like I said, 140 grain bullet at 2650, 2700 feet per second is a pretty typical factory load for the 7x57 for use in modern production rifles with modern factory ammo. You may notice that it's very similar performance to the newer 7mm 08 Remington, and we'll talk a little bit more about that cartridge later in this episode. Now, I'm not sure about any current production American rifles in 7x57 at this instant, but I will say they have been manufactured on and off in this chambering for most of its history. Now, of course, there are lots of surplus military Mauser rifles out there in 7mm Mauser, right? You got the famous 1893 Spanish Mauser, the 1895 Chilean Mauser, the 1902 and 1910 Mexican Mauser, 1904 Portuguese Mauser, 1907 and 1908 Brazilian Mauser, and the 1910 Serbian Mauser, among many others. Various European sporting rifles currently produce rifles in this chambering, right? You got the Mauser M12, M18, and M98 rifles. You also got stuff from CZ, Sacco, and Steyr. At various points over the years, the cartridge was available in the Remington Rolling Block, Model 30, Model 700 rifles, the Winchester Model 54 and Model 70, the Ruger M77, the Ruger number 1. I would not say it is a super popular offering, but it's certainly out there and available in North America. As an example, Winchester only made 729 Model 70s in 7x57 in 1936 before discontinuing the offering and dropping that chambering completely from the Model 70 in 1937. They brought it back again after World War II, but it was still not a blazing success, especially not compared to something like a 270, a 308, or a 30-06. So like I said, you can get it in an American rifle, but it was much more popular in European rifles. And like I also said, Eleanor O'Connor's rifle I just mentioned was a VZ rifle. It is more popular in Europe than in North America, but it also does seem to be fading a little bit there. Not as popular as it used to be. I mentioned in episode 279 when I interviewed James Bradley from the UK when he was talking about his deer hunting there, he talked about how he used to have a 7mm Mauser but switched over to the 270 because he was having a hard time finding ammo for it. So the 7mm Mauser is a very important cartridge, and like I said, it really just kind of sets the tone for the next century going forward for smokeless powder, high-velocity cartridges in general. But it was never a super-duper popular cartridge, especially in North America. This was a cartridge that appealed to a niche of the hunting and shooting communities. It was a pretty big niche and a vocal niche, but a niche nonetheless. It's most important for what it stood for at the time and kind of everything that descended from it. But I will say, the 7x57 or the 257 Rigby is a very classy round, very cool choice for those into classic cartridges like that. All right, next up we have the 7x64 Brenneke. This is a German cartridge designed by a guy named Wilhelm Brenneke. He developed a variety of new rifle cartridges, bullets, shotgun slugs, right? You ever heard of a Brenneke shotgun slug? He was the guy that developed that. He wanted a more powerful alternative to the 8x57 or 8mm Mauser. And like I just said, the 7x57 used a 57mm long case. Well, the 8x57 was a descendant of the 7x57, and Brenneke decided to invent a new round that used a slightly longer 64mm case and a smaller diameter, or rather going back to that 7mm bullet instead of the 8mm bullet the German military was using at the time. So you put those things together, load it to a little bit higher pressure, then voila, you have the 7x64 Brenneke. This round hit the market in 1917 towards the end of World War I as a purely civilian cartridge. Now, it might seem like terrible timing, but it actually worked out great for him. Now, since the 7x64 was not a military round, it found commercial success in the country in the aftermath of World War I, and it escaped some of the associated penalties of the Versailles Treaty restricting the production of military equipment. Now, we talk about in the United States, and in other countries too, but I'll give an example from the United States. Military rounds are very popular among civilians too, right? The 30-06, the 308, the 223 Remington are all great examples of that. Now, the 8x57mm Mauser, you would think would have a similar level of popularity in Europe, especially like in Germany, where it was a popular military cartridge. But the situation was different there in the aftermath of World War I due to the Versailles Treaty. So that actually opened up the door for rounds like the 7x64 Brenneke to have some commercial success. Now, the 7x64 Brenneke is not literally descended from the 30-06, but it looks very similar in overall appearance. It has an overall length of 3.3 inches, a case length of 64mm or 2.522 inches, and a rim diameter of 0.471 inches. It's loaded to a little bit higher pressure than the old 7x57, 50,500 CUP versus 46,000 CUP for the 7x57. A typical load for the 7x64 is a 140 grain bullet at 28 to 2,900 feet per second. Details vary depending on the load, but that's what we're looking at. So around 200-ish, 150, 200 feet per second faster than the 7mm Mauser. So the 7x64 shoots a little flatter, and it's a little more powerful. People called it a quote-unquote wonder cartridge of the early 1900s, and it developed a similar reputation to the 7mm Rim Mag initially, though. We'll talk more about the 7 Rim Mag later. But bottom line, this was one of those cartridges that seemed to work great on game under certain conditions, but it also gained a reputation for wounding game as well. Now, this was possibly due to people trying to use it in marginal situations or at too long of a range, making a shot that they shouldn't have taken, and then blaming the cartridge when things went wrong. Now, Brenneke also released a rim version of the 7x64 in 1920. This was known as the 7x65R. That cartridge very nearly duplicates the performance of the 7x64, but it was designed for use in those break action guns like drillings, doubles, single-shot rifles that are somewhat common in Europe. Now, as is the case with all of the rimmed sisters of rimless bolt-action cartridges, the 7x65R runs on a slightly lower pressure, but it's practically the same cartridge in a different shape. Both of these cartridges are mainly European offerings. You can get rifles from companies like Mauser, Sacco, Steyr, Blosser, Mannlicher, Schoneyer. Remington actually makes 7x64 ammo, though. They have a load with a 140 grain core lock at 2950. That's about 300 feet per second faster than their 7x57 load. And that 7x64 load is virtually identical to their 280 Remington factory load for in the core lock line. And we'll talk more about the 280 here later. You can get a load from PPU with a 140 grain soft point at 2837. S&B also makes both 7x64 and 7x65R loads. This is a cartridge that's pretty well suited for a lot of the same situations as the 7mm Mauser. Since it is a higher velocity cartridge, it does shoot a little flatter. It does give the hunter a little bit more reach, but I also wouldn't say that it really does too much more, say at closer ranges, say 200 yards and in, than the 7x57. Kevin Robertson complained in one of our previous interviews on the podcast that he had one in 7x64R and did not like that it damaged so much meat due to that higher velocity impact that it was delivering at closer range. Since that's the situations he was doing a lot of his hunting in, he didn't like that. He didn't need something that he was going to take a 400-yard shot on an animal at, so he actually had that rifle re-chambered to 7x57. This cartridge is still hanging around, though, more popular in Europe than anywhere else, but a good number of people still use it, and it's all in all pretty darn good cartridge. Moving on, let's talk about the 280 Remington, like I just teased. Introduced in 1957 by Remington, the 280 Remington is basically a 30-06 neck down to 28 caliber or 7mm. This is a great example of a cartridge, along with the 6mm Remington and the 260 Remington, of a round with a lot of potential that just fell flat due to poor execution on the part of Remington. The 280 Remington falls in between the 270 and the 30-06 in terms of performance. A 270 will fire a 130 grain bullet at around 3,000 feet per second. The 280 will fire a 140 grain bullet at about that velocity, and the 30-06 will do the same thing with a 150 grain bullet. But that 140 grain 7mm bullet will have a higher BC and sectional density than the other two bullets. So the 280 has that advantage over the other two cartridges, though it is admittedly a small edge. Now, all things considered, the 280 should have been a success, but the company made a couple of major blunders when they rolled out their new cartridge. First, they introduced the 280 Remington in their Model 740 autoloader. Jim Carmichael said that the folks at Remington wanted a cartridge with the Remington name that delivered 270-ish performance out of their Model 740 autoloader. I'm not sure if he was guessing or if he had hard info on that point or the one that follows. But he said the 270 was finicky with that rifle, and some loads for the cartridge would work fine. Others for the 270 presented problems. So they wanted something similar that would work consistently and also had the Remington name. And to their credit, the 280 Remington seemed to check those boxes and indeed worked quite reliably in that rifle. Later, they also offered it in their Model 742 autoloader and their Model 760 slide action, before finally offering it in the Model 721 and 725 bolt-action rifles. They did eventually get around to offering it in their legendary Model 700 bolt-action, but they dropped it after a couple of years before finally reintroducing it in the Model 700 in 1979. Regardless of the exact reasons they did what they did, the cartridge was either primarily or only available in the Model 740 or 742 autoloader during many of those critical early years the cartridge hit the market. Now, while pump action and auto-loading rifles are great for certain hunting situations, the extremely restricted availability of the .280 Remington for many years, especially the fact that it was not available in any bolt-action rifles for a little bit of time, was a major factor that kept it from achieving more widespread acceptance among hunters. Also, the introduction of the massively successful 7mm Remington Magnum in 1962 also hurt prospects for the .280 catching on to any real big degree with the general hunting public. We'll talk about the 7 Rim Mag later, but realize right now it is a larger and more powerful cartridge than the .280. So I could understand why it did overshadow the slightly older .280. However, the management at Remington reintroduced the .280 Remington in 1979 as the 7mm Express Remington in a bid to rebrand the .280 to something more glamorous. As you can imagine, though, the name change resulted in a lot of confusion between the 7mm Express and the 7mm Remington Magnum. Those two cartridges are not interchangeable, and I'm sure there was more than a few cases of a guy with a .280 Remington rifle buying 7 Rim Mag ammo and getting mad that it wouldn't work in his rifle and vice versa. So, Remington renamed the cartridge again after a few years, went back to the .280 Remington. That's what the cartridge is called today. Now, even after all of that mess and confusion, the cartridge is still hanging around despite all of that. So, like I said, it's basically a 30-06 neck down to 7mm. Not literally exactly the same case as the 30-06, though it is almost identical. They did move the shoulder forward a little bit to prevent accidental chambering in a .270 Winchester rifle, which uses smaller diameter bullets. So you could run into big problems if you manage to chamber and fire a .280 Remington cartridge in a .270 Winchester rifle. .280 Remington has a 60,000 psi SAAMI maximum average pressure. Not sure why they didn't go all the way to 65,000 psi like the .270, but they did what they did. All things considered, the .280 is a very balanced, well-mannered rifle. Current factory loads fire a 140-grain bullet at nearly 3,000 feet per second, or a 150-grain bullet at about 2,900 feet per second. It will work with heavier bullets, too. Nosler offers a factory load with a 160-grain partition at 2775 feet per second. You could also even hand-load 175-grain bullets. Hornady offers .280 Remington ammo in their Precision Hunter line with a 150-grain ELDX at 2925. Now, in addition to that Hornady load and the Nosler load I just mentioned, you can also get ammo from Federal, Norma, Remington, and Winchester. And in addition to those Remington rifles I listed a minute ago, the Ruger M77 and number 1 and the Browning X-Bolt were all available in the .280 Remington at one time or another. Podcast listener, email subscriber, David Southard is a big fan of the .280 Remington. He is a true disciple of the cartridge. He has a couple of Ruger rifles in that chambering, and he has taken a wide range of game with it. Stuff ranging from deer up to and including eland. He actually just got back from a hunt in Africa with his .280. He used 160-grain Accubons and partitions on that hunt, and he took a pretty wide range of plains game on that hunt. He took an eland, he took a couple of Inyala, some other stuff. Everything worked great. Funny enough, he actually physically possesses some 7mm Express head-stamped brass, too. Now, the biggest problem with the .280 Remington right now is it's just not a very widely available cartridge. It works really well if you get the logistics sorted out, if you hand load or you find some factory ammo for it, and there is factory ammo available for it, like I mentioned, but it's just not as common in anything as some other rounds, like the .270 and the 30-06 and some of the other rounds we talk about in this episode, like the 7 Rim Mag, the 708, the 7 PRC. But if you're able to overcome those issues, the .280 Remington is a darn solid rifle cartridge. It gives you almost all the good stuff you want out of a rifle cartridge without much of the bad stuff. Not a lot of recoil, not a lot of muzzle blast, combined with very good ballistic and terminal performance. In terms of recoil, we're talking about a little bit less than a 30-06, tiny bit more than a 270. So right in that sweet spot where a lot of people do really well. It's really too bad the initial rollout of the 280 Remington was not more successful because it is a very solid round. All right, so next up, we'll talk about the 280 Ackley Improved. Now, I have mentioned P.O. Ackley and his formula for improving cartridges in the past. Basically, he would take a cartridge, remove most of the body taper from the case, then give that case a steep 40-degree shoulder. He applied that sort of formula to darn near any cartridge you can think of. Well, he did it to the 280 Remington as well, and the 280 AI or 280 Ackley Improved is the only SAAMI standardized Ackley Improved cartridge. Nosler actually standardized the 280 Ackley with SAAMI in 2008. Now, in addition to the changes to the case I just mentioned, the 280 Ackley also has a higher SAAMI max pressure than the 280 Remington, 65,000 psi versus 60,000 psi. So you combine that higher pressure with the additional case capacity you get by removing the case taper and going from a 17 to a 40-degree shoulder, and you get a nice jump in performance. So you can shoot that same 140 grain AccuBond at 3,200 feet per second instead of 3,000 feet per second for the 280. That's actually 75 feet per second faster than what Nosler advertises the 140 grain AccuBond for the 7mm rim mag. Now the 7 rim mag probably has a higher ceiling on its performance, especially with hand loads, but the 280 Ackley comes darn close. Now, I do not think it is inaccurate to say the 280 Ackley can deliver 7mm Remington Magnum-like performance. And as a matter of fact, it can do so while using a little bit less powder. For instance, the Nosler 9th edition reloading manual lists virtually identical velocities in hand loads for the 280 Ackley and the 7mm rim mag with that 140 grain AccuBond. Both loads use the same type of powder, but the 280 Ackley achieves that velocity with 6 fewer grains of powder. So you get that velocity with a tiny bit less recoil. Plus, it is also used in a slimmer case based on the 30-06 instead of the 375. So you can, depending on the rifle, get an additional round in the magazine with the 280 Ackley versus the 7 rim mag. As is the case with all Ackley Improved cartridges, you can shoot 280 Remington ammo in a 280 Ackley rifle. Doing so will fireform the brass, so you can take that brass from the old 280 Remington, hand load it like normal, and then use it in your 280 Ackley if you are a hand loader. As I record this, Nosler offers 4 factory loads for the regular 280 Remington and 6 factory loads for the 280 Ackley. Federal does offer ammo in their Terminal Ascent line as well with a 155 grain Terminal Ascent. Weatherby also makes ammo for the 280 Ackley. Hornady also offers the 280 Ackley in their Precision Hunter line with a 162 grain ELDX. That's the same as the 7 rim mag, a little bit heavier than the 150 grain ELDX they use in their 280 Remington ammo in the Precision Hunter line. Barnes also makes a factory load in their Vortex long range line with a 152 grain LRX bullet after much urging from Joseph von Benedict and his followers. In terms of rifles, you can get rifles from Weatherby, Savage, Christensen Arms, and Fierce. You can also get a fully custom rifle, or you can do a semi-custom job where you take a rifle with a 30-06 length chamber and then rechamber it to 280 Ackley. My friend Joseph von Benedict is one of the modern-day disciples of the round. Same is also true with Ron Spomer, though not quite to the degree as JVB. The 280 Ackley is a great cartridge. It is more specialized and has a more niche appeal than, say, the 7mm rim mag, but this is a more mainstream offering in the USA right now than, say, the regular 280 Remington, the 7x64, or even really probably the 7x57. Next, we will cover 3 cartridges that took different but very similar paths that ultimately accomplished nearly the same thing. The 7mm Weatherby Magnum, the 7x61 Sharpe and Hart, and the 7mm Remington Magnum. First, we'll talk about the 7mm Weatherby. While the last few cartridges I talked about were all similar in overall size to the 30-06, even if they are not directly related to it, these next three cartridges all use the 300 or 375 H&H as a parent case. Now, the 7 Weatherby came along first, 1944. Formula for developing this cartridge was very similar to the 257 and 270 Weatherby. You take a 300 H&H case, blow it out, neck it down to 7mm in this case, remove some of the taper, give it the signature double radius shoulder, and there you have it, the 7mm Weatherby Magnum. Like the 257 and 270, this cartridge fits in a standard length rifle action, just like the 30-06, loaded to a maximum SAAMI average pressure of 65,000 psi. Now, this was not a super popular Weatherby cartridge, and this occurred probably for a couple of reasons. So first, initial twist rate for rifles in this chambering was 1 in 12 inches. That's a pretty slow twist for a 7mm. The cartridge could use 140 and 150 grain bullets fine, but it did not do too well with the heavier stuff. Weatherby eventually bumped the cartridge up to a 1 in 10 inch twist rate. Next, the 7mm Weatherby also had to compete with the 257, 270, and 300 Weatherby Magnums. All of those cartridges used bullet diameters that were more popular than the 7mm bullet diameter in the USA, possibly due to the fact that they were just more classic American offerings. And that was especially true with the 270 and 30 caliber cartridges. Also, all 7mm Weatherby rifles were custom jobs initially. You had to send Roy your rifle. He would rechamber it for you. Now, that did change in the late 1950s when Weatherby started producing their 9-lug Mark V action rifles. But that next shoe dropped in 1962 when the 7mm Remington Magnum came out. And as we'll talk about here very shortly, I keep teasing it, the 7 Rem Mag offered very similar performance out of the new Model 700 rifle. That rifle was much more widely available and less expensive than a Weatherby rifle. Now, Weatherby is the only company I know of that ever made ammo for this cartridge. They currently offer 4 loads for it. 140 grain TTSX at 3250, 146 grain Hammer, 150 grain Sirocco, and a 154 grain Interlock at 3225. You can also do a hand load of 140 grain AccuBond at 3300 feet per second, according to the Nosler manual. Compare that to a current Nosler factory load for the 7 Rem Mag of a 140 grain AccuBond at 3125. So the Weatherby is certainly faster, but it's really close. And there's also lots of stuff in the 3200 to 3300 foot per second range if you hand load, according to the Nosler manual. So the Rem Mag is probably a little bit slower than the Weatherby, but they're basically the same, though. Very little difference. So you compare that 140 grain AccuBond at 3300 for the 7mm Weatherby to 3200 for the 280 Ackley, 3000 for the 280 Remington, and 2700 for the 7mm Mauser. Definite step up in performance. Now, interestingly, the 7mm Weatherby is the oldest still in production 7mm Magnum cartridge. Not a darn thing wrong with it. It's perfect for a guy that likes Weatherby rifles and cartridges and you want a 7mm. Perfect for deer, antelope, elk, African Plains game, all of that stuff. Now, David, the guy I mentioned earlier with the 280 Remington, actually owned a 7mm Weatherby many years ago. He said he eventually sold it because the real-world performance of the cartridge wasn't a big enough jump over his 280 Remington that he felt the need to have it. Lots of other people felt the same way about the 7mm Weatherby versus the 7mm Remington Magnum. Weatherby is the sole provider of rifles and ammo right now. Oh, and by the way, ammo for the 7mm Weatherby, like anything else you'd find directly from Weatherby, is going to be more expensive than for a more conventional cartridge from a conventional company like Remington, Winchester, or even Nosler. Now we'll talk about the 7x61 Sharpe and Hart. Now, I reference Phil Sharpe's book, The Rifle in America, often in these episodes. Well, Phil Sharpe partnered with a guy named Richard Hart to make another 7mm Magnum cartridge using the H&H Magnum case as a parent in 1953. So they did so after the Weatherby, but before the Remington Magnum. They called it the 7x61 Sharpe and Hart. This cartridge is standardized with CIP, but not with SAAMI. Now, the cartridge basically used a 375 H&H Magnum case, shortened and neck down. In this case, it actually used a pretty sharp 44-degree shoulder. They partnered with a gun maker named Schultz and Larsen in Denmark, and then got Norma to make ammo for the cartridge. Initial reports about the 7x61 were really good. The cartridge seemed to perform as advertised. The ammo seemed to be high quality and accurate. Same thing with the rifles. It delivered basically identical performance to the 7mm Remington Magnum, but in a situation similar to the .308 Norma I described in the .30 caliber episode, the arrival of a new American Magnum basically killed it. Here's what Ron Spomer had to say about the 7x61 in his book, 7mm Cartridges from Around the World. Reports of the day held the Sharpe and Hart in high regard. It was performing nip and tuck with the 7mm Weatherby Magnum. The Norma ammo was excellent. The rifles were accurate, but they were Danish, and this was America. Neither Schultz and Larsen nor Norma were household names in the U.S. One can imagine that not every gun shop and hardware store in America kept them on the shelf. This was a similar situation that faced Roy Weatherby, but Weatherby was a marketing genius. He knew how to work the star system, getting his proprietary rifles into the hands of the rich and famous, especially Hollywood stars like Roy Rogers, Clark Gable, and John Wayne. But Uncle Henry and Cousin Vinny rarely saw a Weatherby or a Schultz and Larsen in the local hardware store or gas station. So how could they buy one? Good though the 7x61 Sharpe and Hart cartridge was, too few potential buyers could conveniently find it. End of quote. And that was the end of the 7x61. Now we'll move on to the next round, the 7mm Remington Magnum that came out in 1962. I have mentioned this cartridge several times so far. Now we'll talk about it in detail. I am not shy about calling out Remington when they screw up the rollout of a cartridge like they did with the .280. But, that said, I will give them credit where credit is due. They've designed and released several awesome rounds as well. The 7mm Remington Magnum is a great example of one of those rounds. As I have mentioned in the past, lots of people wanted Magnum performance out of a standard action cartridge after World War II. So Winchester rolled out a whole new line of belted Magnum cartridges based on neck-down 375 H&H cases, shortened to fit in a standard linked action rifle. Remember, same as a 30-06 instead of a full Magnum linked action like a 375. The 264, 338, and 458 Win Mag are all examples of these cartridges from the 1950s. Remington followed suit in 1962 with their 7mm Remington Magnum and the new Model 700 rifle. Perhaps you've heard of that rifle. Now, the 7 Rim Mag has a design very similar to the 7x61 and the 7mm Weatherby. It's an H&H case, shortened, neck down to .284 caliber. In this case, the 7 Rim Mag has a 2.5-inch long case and a 3.29-inch overall length. This round did great straight out of the gate. Shot 150-grain bullets faster and flatter than the 270. Shot 175-grain bullets faster and flatter than 180-grain bullets from the 30-06. Remington marketed the round as a hard-hitting, flat-shooting rifle cartridge, ideal for hunting big game in North America. Great for elk, moose, the big bears, that sort of thing, but you could also use it on an open country deer or antelope hunt, too. The cartridge itself was great, but the fact that the 7 Rim Mag was also available in a reasonably priced, widely available, and still pretty high-quality rifle in the Remington Model 700 also helped push it over the top. In fact, the success of that new rifle with the 7 Rim Mag and other cartridges Remington offered it in was one of the factors that persuaded the folks at Winchester to redesign their Model 70 rifle so as to better compete with the less expensive Model 700 on a price basis in 1964. Right, you've heard of the pre- and post-64 Winchester Model 70s? Well, that was a direct result of the success of the Model 700. Remington's Big 7 got off to a hot start after they rolled it out. And sort of like I described earlier with the 7x64, some hunters started to ascribe almost magical killing abilities to the round. Now, sometimes it worked great, but the 7 Rim Mag also started to develop that reputation as a wounder in some circles. Indeed, prior to the advent of the 6.5 Creedmoor, the 7 Rim Mag was actually one of the more hated cartridges in some circles of elk hunters due to its reputation as a quote-unquote wounder. I'm not exactly sure why that's the case, but I have some ideas. One was due to the outsized reputation of the 7 Rim Mag, people were just simply using it in situations they should not have, like taking a shot at way too long of a range. Yes, you can kill an elk with a 7mm Remington Magnum at 700 yards, but you really need to know what you're doing before attempting a shot like that, especially back in the 1960s and 70s. Next, especially in the early days of the cartridge, it's possible Remington and other companies were making factory loads using some bullets that weren't tough enough to stand up to the higher velocity impacts possible with the 7 Rim Mag at close range. Right, you take a light bullet designed for use at a moderate muzzle velocity from the 7mm Mauser, you jack that velocity up by another couple hundred feet per second, then shoot an elk in the shoulder at 100 yards, you could be in for a really long day. Now, the first factory loads featured 150 and 175 grain bullets that were marketed as popular for game ranging in size from deer to grizzlies. Wayne Van Zwall said that after a time afield with his 7mm Remington Magnum that he asked a supervisor in Remington's ammo section why they weren't offering a 160 grain bonded pointed bullet. He said that the guy replied to him that they had a lot of blunt nose 175 grain bullets on hand. So you could say that the folks at Remington were not optimizing their factory ammo for some situations at the very beginning. I will say, eventually those problems were resolved. The cartridge is still around today, and it is easily the most popular 7mm cartridge in the world. And I'll tell you, it is popular with a capital P. Everybody makes guns and ammo for it. And you can find factory loads with 140, 150, 160, and 175 grain bullets. For instance, Nosler makes a load with 140 grain Accubon at 3125 for just over 3,000 foot-pounds of energy. You can get a load from Remington with 150 grain Corlock at 3110 feet per second for 3,200 foot-pounds of energy. A 160 grain partition from Nosler at 2,950 for just under 3,100 foot-pounds of energy. I think that is a great all-around load that you could use for darn near anything you'd be reasonably hunting with this cartridge. You can also get a factory load with a 175 grain Corlock at 2,860 feet per second for also just under 3,200 foot-pounds of energy. Now, the cartridge does seem to have been downloaded from its early days. I mean, current factory loads versus the original factory loads. I'm not exactly sure why that's the case. I'm also not exactly sure why the 7 Rim Mag has a max SAAMI average pressure of 61,000 psi, but that is the deal with it. I will say, though, that if you look in modern reloading manuals from Hornady, Nosler, whoever, you can see that you can safely boost the muzzle velocity by 100 to 200 feet per second with the same weight bullet versus a factory load if you are so inclined. So this is one of those cartridges a hand loader can noticeably and safely enhance the performance of versus factory ammo. You do need a 24 to 26 inch long barrel for optimum performance, though, with this cartridge. Some of these other cartridges we've talked about to this point, like the 7mm Mauser and 280 Remington, can get away with 20, 22-inch long barrels without as much of a drop-off in performance. Now, the 300 Winchester Magnum, which came out in 1963, so the year after the 7mm Remington Magnum, is a little more powerful and it recoils a little more. But the 7mm Rim Mag is usually a little flatter shooting and does a little bit better in the wind at normal hunting ranges with the same bullets. All things considered, though, the 7mm Remington Magnum is a great cartridge. You get a little bit more recoil than a 30-06, but still not bad. And so you're getting solid Magnum-level performance without terrible recoil. Not really too much more to say about it. Great all-around hunting caliber. You can get a rifle from darn near any rifle company in this chambering. Same thing with ammo. All right, next up is the 7mm Shooting Times Westerner. This is the brainchild of gunwriter Lane Simpson, developed 1989. Now, Lane wrote for Shooting Times So that is the origin of the name. He initially called it the 7mm Maximum. It is an 8mm Remington Magnum neck down to 7mm. And the 8mm Rim Mag is basically a full-length 375 H&H neck down to 8mm. So unlike the 7mm Remington Magnum, the 7mm STW, or Shooting Times Westerner, requires a full-length Magnum action, has an overall length of 3.6 inches. You could describe the 7mm STW as a 7mm Rim Mag with an afterburner. This was the first big game hunting cartridge to reach the 3,500 foot per second threshold while using bullets appropriate for bigger game. So you can really push some bullets pretty darn fast out of this cartridge. The 7 STW crossed that threshold with a 140 grain bullet. That is a spicy load for this cartridge. A Square does list a couple of hand loads in any shot you want. They say reach that 3,500 feet per second threshold with a 140 grain bullet, but they also say they're over 65,000 PSI in terms of pressure. The Hornady, Nosler, and Lyman manuals I also consulted all advertise slower velocities with a 140 grain bullet, but they do offer some options that cross the 3,500 foot per second threshold with a 120 or 130 grain bullet, though. We can quibble with the details on this, but all things considered, the 7mm STW is a very fast, very flat shooting round. Now, like I mentioned, it is an 8mm Rim Mag neck down to 7mm. Now, the 8mm Remington Magnum was one of those rounds Remington released that just did not go anywhere, and it was kind of a dying round. But in the 1980s, Lane Simpson, like I mentioned, came up with this idea to make the 7mm STW using that round as a parent case. I read an article he wrote and published online talking about the origins of the cartridge, and he said that he conceived it as a Wildcat, really liked the performance of it, pitched it to Remington. They weren't really interested initially, but he started writing more about the cartridge. Word got out about the fantastic performance you could get from it, and then the folks at Remington saw a massive spike in demand for 8mm Remington brass that people could use to neck down to make their own cartridges. When they saw that happen, people actually voting with their wallets for this cartridge, they got a lot more interested in it, and then they picked up the cartridge and eventually ended up getting it standardized with SAAMI. Now, of course, after Remington actually picked up the round, they started selling long-action Model 700s in 7mm STW. They also produced Core-Lock ammo for it. A Square produced factory 7mm STW ammo for a time as well. And then, of course, lots of people also just took a 7mm Remington Magnum rifle and reamed out their chamber to the new chambering. This is a great round for long-range work on lighter game. You could use it on bigger game too. Actually, Joseph von Benedict tells a story in his podcast of Dave Emery killing a moose with a 7mm Shooting Times Westerner at over 600 yards in Alaska using a hand load with a 175 grain ELDX bullet. Hornady advertises 3,000 feet per second as a max hand load with that bullet in their reloading manual. That is awfully close to the performance of a much newer round we'll talk about later. Now, Lane Simpson says he pushed a 160 grain AccuBond at 3,200 feet per second with this cartridge. So that's about 200 feet per second faster than the same bullet from the 7mm Remington Magnum in factory ammo. He said he got 37 feet per second with a 140 grain Core-Lock using factory ammo from his rifle. Like I said, the Remington 700 was a popular rifle in this chambering. It was also available in the Ruger number 1, and of course, lots of custom and semi-custom jobs with it for a while. Hornady and Nosler are the only companies that make factory ammo for the round right now. You can get a load with a 162 grain ELDX at 3,050 feet per second from Hornady and their Precision Hunter line, but that's only a little bit faster than their loading for the 7 Rim Mag in that same line, which is 2975. So that's just 75 feet per second faster. Nosler offers a load with a 175 grain AccuBond long range at 2,950 feet per second. That's great performance, but today it's not a gigantic difference from more conventional rounds. It is also burning a lot more powder for that minimal gain in velocity. Because it is burning so much more powder, the 7mm STW requires at least a 26-inch long barrel for optimum performance. This round really shined in the 1900s and early 2000s before the advent of laser rangefinders, right? People that wanted a fast, flat shooting cartridge to stretch their shooting range out a bit really appreciated the performance of this round. Now we're seeing a trend away from extreme velocity. We'll talk more about that later. But for instance, Nosler lists a hand load in their manual with a 120 grain ballistic tip at 3,600 feet per second. That gives you just 26 inches of bullet drop at 500 yards. It actually doesn't go above 1 inch above the line of sight inside 200 yards. So if you go with a 300 yard zero, you're about 3 inches high at 150, just 19 and a half inches low at 500 yards. Either way, that bullet is still going 24-33 feet per second at 500 yards, retaining over 1,500 foot-pounds of energy. So you compare that load, 120 grain ballistic tip at 3,600 feet per second, to a 140 grain Accubon from a 7 rim mag. That load is only doing 2185 at 500 with 1483 foot-pounds of energy with 35 inches of bullet drop. So certainly flatter. But then again, Nosler also advertises a 120 grain ballistic tip hand load for the 7 rim mag, going maybe 50 feet per second slower than that 7mm STW load. But it burns 70 instead of 92 grains of powder to get that performance. So like I said, great cartridge, 1980s, late 80s, 1990s, early 2000s, but I feel like its time has passed and it is fading away. There are a couple of other high-octane 7mm rounds we'll talk about here in a minute that stole a lot of its thunder, and that's one of the reasons why this round is fading. I'm going to very briefly talk about another round called the 7mm STE, or Shooting Times Easterner. This is not a SAAMI standardized cartridge, and like I said, I'm only going to briefly talk about it. This was another Lane Simpson project. As I mentioned in my 30 caliber episode, the 307 Winchester basically delivered 300 Savage performance in a tubular magazine. The 307 Winchester was very similar in overall appearance to a 308 Winchester case, but with a rim and with using flat-nosed bullets. Well, this 7mm STE, or Shooting Times Easterner, is basically a 307 Winchester neck down to 7mm. Lane rechambered a Marlin 336 to 7mm, then reamed the chamber out appropriately. He said he was getting about 2,900 feet per second with a 120 grain bullet and about 2,700 feet per second with a 139 grain bullet. Like I said, lever gun cartridge, used flat-nosed bullets. Not earth-shaking performance, but not bad either, especially compared to the next 7mm cartridge. Now, that next cartridge is the 730 Waters. Developed in 1984, this round was the brainchild of Ken Waters, who wrote for Handloader magazine. This cartridge was the result of a partnership between Ken, Federal, and Winchester Repeating Arms. It's basically a 30-30 Winchester case, neck down to 7mm. Winchester released their new Winchester Model 1894 angle eject lever action rifle in this chambering, then Federal produced ammo at the same time. This cartridge could push a 139 grain flat pointed bullet at 2,600 feet per second. That's quite a bit faster than the 30-30 fires a 150 grain bullet, which is about 2,400 feet per second. So this gives the 730 a flatter trajectory with also less recoil. Federal also released a load shooting a 120 grain bullet at 2,700 feet per second. So that's certainly an improvement, but not a massive shift from the 30-30. And the 730 Waters really never caught on in the rifle world. But it did really well in Thompson Center contender handguns. And that's really where it actually saw the most use. The cartridge was restricted to flat-tipped bullets and lever-action rifles with that tubular magazine, like I've talked about in the past. But if you're using it in a single-shot handgun, you can use a pointed 7mm bullet. And that opens up a lot of possibilities for all those great 7mm bullets out there designed for use in the more conventional 7mm rifle cartridges. Load one of those bullets into a 730 Waters, and it's a pretty efficient, small, compact cartridge that did still pretty well out of a shorter barreled handgun. Now, the 730 Waters is starting to fade away. I don't think anybody makes ammo for it anymore. It's basically a handloader's proposition right now, but it's a cool choice. and still has something of a cult following, especially among handgun hunters. Next, we have the 7mm 08 Remington. Just like the name says, this is essentially a .308 Winchester case necked down to 7mm. This round started out as a Wildcat. Remington knew a good thing when they saw it. They adopted it, standardized it with SAAMI 1980. It shoots a 140 grain bullet about as fast as the .308 shoots a 150 grain bullet. But that 140 grain 7mm projectile has a higher BC and sectional density, and it does that with less recoil versus the .308. Similar dynamic here with the 708 versus the .308, as was the case with the .280 Remington versus the 30-06. Now, the 7mm 08 does have a reputation as a light recoiling round, and that reputation is well-deserved. It is indeed a great choice for smaller framed and or more recoil-shy hunters. But it's not limited just to people like that either. Indeed, it is a very capable cartridge on its own. It's actually a little bit more powerful than the 7x57 Mauser. Now, the Mauser case is a tiny bit larger, but the 708 is loaded to a higher pressure, 61,000 psi, SAAMI maximum average pressure for the 708. So with all that stuff in mind, you get a little bit smaller case, higher pressure. It can push the same weight bullet 100 to 200-ish feet per second faster than the 7 Mauser. It's just a little bit less powerful than the .280 Remington. So the .280 Remington shooting a 140 grain bullet at about 3,000 feet per second. The 708 is doing that at 2850, 2860, thereabouts. The 7 Rim Mag shoots the same weight bullet about another 100-ish feet per second faster than the .280. So it's 200 to 300 feet per second faster than the 7mm 08. The 7x57 seems to be a better choice with heavier 175 grain bullets, but the 7mm 08 really seems to shine in that 140 to 150 grain bullet range. It can use 160 grain bullets too, and you can find factory loads sometimes with that bullet weight in it, but that's on the upper end of what the cartridge really excels at. This is a true short-action cartridge. It will work great in a very lightweight rifle, both from a size and from a recoil perspective. This is a wonderful cartridge for use on whitetail and similar size game, but not limited to just that usage, though. People use it on elk and the like all the time. Randy Newberg actually killed a Sharpe moose in Montana with his 7mm 08 a couple years ago, and it worked great for him. Funny enough, the 7mm 08 actually compares favorably to the .270 Winchester in many respects. It's not quite as powerful, and it's not quite as flat shooting, but it fills a similar niche in utility with less recoil and in a smaller overall package. The 7mm 08 is not quite as popular as the 7mm Remington Magnum, but this is a very common, very popular cartridge, especially in North America. Availability for ammo in particular was really rough during the ammo shortage, but we seem to be doing really good on that front now as I record this. Ammunition and rifles are pretty widespread. You have a pretty good variety from the usual manufacturers. Almost any mainstream ammo company is going to make ammo for the 7mm 08. Same thing with rifles. All right, now let's talk about the .284 Winchester. Released in 1963, the .284 Winchester was an attempt by the folks at Winchester to create a short, compact round with similar performance to the .270 and .280, but do so out of a fast-handling lever-action rifle or a semi-auto. They accomplished this by building a short, fat cartridge with a 35-degree shoulder and a rebated rim, still compatible with standard rifle bolt faces, and then released it in their Model 88 lever action and Model 100 semi-auto rifles. The cartridge was well designed, and it actually had more case capacity than the longer .270 and .280 cartridges. Case length for the .284 Winchester was 2.17 inches, overall length just 2.8 inches, so it could fit in a short, or .308 Winchester, length rifle action. Published ballistics were great too, with an advertised velocity of 2,900 feet per second with a 150 grain bullet that compared favorably to that bullet weight from the .270, the .280, and the 7x57. But like we've seen before, it was likely hampered by the rifles it was available in. While accuracy was certainly good enough for use at shorter range, those Model 88 and Model 100 rifles just weren't capable of tack driving accuracy, and the 284 Winchester just didn't do much a hunter couldn't do just as well with another more widely available, more established cartridge. Right? I mean, a guy who wanted 270 performance could just go out and get a 270. Likewise, a guy could get a 7mm Weatherby or a 7mm rim mag if they wanted something more powerful. The cartridge did not die completely, but it was on life support until hunters discovered it was an ideal choice for someone who wanted plenty of reach on a hunt, but also wanted an extremely lightweight rifle. For instance, Melvin Forbes offered his ultra-light arms Model 20 in 284 Winchester, and that combination was almost tailor-made for a mountain hunter. Ron Spomer actually had one of those rifles in 284 Winchester. He took on some sheep hunts and did really well with it. Now, while the cartridge did well in that role, the 284 Winchester's biggest legacy is actually its use as a parent case for the 450 Bushmaster and especially the 6.5 284 Norma. Winchester currently offers one factory load for the 284 Winchester, 150 grain power point at 2,860 feet per second. That is fine for deer and the like, but you really need to hand load to get the most out of this cartridge. I'm not aware of any current production rifles in 284 Winchester, but there are plenty of old Model 88s and Model 100s out there. It was also available in the Savage 99 and the Browning A-Bolt too. I think Dakota also made some rifles in 284 Winchester, but not much going on with the 284 Winchester at this instant. All right, next we have the 7mm Winchester Short Magnum, released 2002. While those last couple of short-action cartridges I've discussed are all well and good, some people began to wonder in the late 1990s, what if we could get the performance of the 7mm Remington Magnum out of a true short-action cartridge? Well, that's what Winchester did with the 7mm Winchester Short Magnum they released in 2002. This is a beltless cartridge with a slightly rebaited rim, right? The rim is just a little bit smaller in diameter than the case body. It uses a very short and fat, yet very efficient cartridge. Some say all of the Winchester Short Magnums, to include the 7mm, are based on. Some say it was inspired by the 404 Jeffrey cartridge. Either way, the 404 Jeffrey has a slightly fatter body than even the belted portion of the 375 H&H. So for this reason, you get a larger diameter container to put that powder in with the 404 Jeffrey and with these other cartridges like the Winchester Short Magnums. That's especially true if the cartridge has minimal body taper, like the Winchester Short Magnums do. This is why the 7mm Winchester Short Magnum nearly matches the 7mm Remington Magnum in case capacity, yet it does so in a much shorter package. With a max length of 2.86 inches, it fits in a short-action rifle, right? Same as the 308. That's about a half-inch shorter than the 7mm Remington Magnum. Now, Winchester actually advertises their 7mm WSM loads as being a little bit faster than the 7mm Remington Magnum 2. They currently make 3 loads for the 7mm WSM. 140 grain ballistic silver tip, 150 grain power point, 160 grain AccuBond in their ballistic silver tip, power point, and Expedition Big Game long range lines. All 3 are advertised as going about 100 feet per second and change faster than the equivalent 7mm rim mag loads from Winchester. Hand loads are very similar in performance, but the Remington Magnum seems to outperform the Winchester Short Magnum in terms of velocity when using heavier bullets. The Winchester Short Magnums have a couple of other nice little advantages. One is the slightly fatter and shorter powder column they have is a little bit more efficient, and it possibly provides an accuracy boost over the longer and skinnier powder column of the 7 Rim Mag. And the cartridge also doesn't need quite as long of a barrel for optimum performance. 24 to 26 inch long barrels are most common with the 7mm Rim Mag, but 24 and 22 inch long barrels were available with the 7mm Winchester Short Magnum. There's also a tiny bit of advantage in terms of recoil too for the Short Magnum, since it burns less powder to get nearly the same velocity. You do potentially lose some magazine capacity with the Winchester Short Magnum, though, because it has just a fatter, wider case, and sometimes, it depends on the rifle, you can fit one more Remington Magnum cartridge in the magazine than is the case with the Winchester Short Magnum. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, John, this seems like a wonderful concept. Why isn't it more popular? Well, I have mentioned in some of my other podcast episodes, there was some drama with a guy named Rick Jameson and a patent he managed to get for a certain cartridge design principle. I'm going to read another blurb for you from Ron Spomer's 7mm book. This is from the 7mm Winchester Short Magnum section of the book. Ron has just finished talking about the short, fat design principle I just mentioned to you. I quote, "In the late 1990s, gunwriter and ballistician Rick Jameson applied this concept to several of his Wildcat cartridges and, unlike most cartridge developers, went through the trouble of patenting his concepts. Thus, when Winchester released its WSM series just a few years later, Jameson was able to sue. His patents were broad enough to cover a wide category of short, fat designs, several of which he'd reportedly shown Winchester in the hopes they would commercialize them. The legal settlement essentially pulled the rug out from under the WSMs and WSSMs by requiring Winchester to pay royalties to Jameson." End of quote. So we have another pretty cool concept here that just didn't quite make it. Maybe things would have gone better if there wouldn't have been that patent drama and royalty drama, but we'll never really know. The 7mm Winchester Short Magnum is on the way out the door. Nobody makes rifles for them anymore. Winchester and Browning did. Ruger also made a very small number. Ammo has also been really hard to get. Winchester's the only company that continues to make ammo for the cartridge as I record this. All right, next, let's talk about the 7 SAUM, or the 7mm Remington Short Action Ultra Magnum. This is another short, fat cartridge with a rebated rim, with a case very similar in appearance to a shortened 404 Jeffrey case. The 7 SAUM is also rated at 65,000 PSI, just like the 7 WSM, also released in 2002. Now, the difference between these two cartridges is the 7 SAUM is a little bit shorter overall, has a tiny bit less powder capacity than the Winchester Short Magnum. This is because Remington short-action rifles are a tiny bit shorter than Winchester short-action rifles. And Winchester released their new 7mm WSM just a couple months before Remington did. All in all, the 7 SAUM was very similar in performance to the 7mm Remington Magnum and the 7mm Winchester Short Magnum. Remington made a load with 150 grain core lock at 3,110 feet per second. Nosler also makes a load with 160 grain Accubon at 2850. The 7 SAUM just never really caught on. That's probably because it lagged in performance a little bit behind the Winchester Short Magnum and the full-size Remington Magnum. The fact that it also came out a few months after the Winchester cartridge also probably hurt it a little bit too. Those differences just weren't that significant, but it also was enough to almost kill it. Funny enough, the 7 SAUM has really found new life in the custom rifle realm. It is a very efficient, balanced cartridge. It has a lot of head height, and it has a long neck length. And those characteristics, as well as the fact that it just seems to have exactly the right powder capacity, make it an ideal candidate to pair with really long, efficient, high BC bullets. And it seems to deliver really, really good accuracy with those. And all in all, it seems to be just a great package of very efficient, balanced performance that gives good ballistics. With those long, heavy, high BC bullets, you can do it in a short action rifle, and it gives really good accuracy. For instance, Mark Helsing from Exo Mountain Gear hunts a lot with a custom 7 SAUM rifle. He says he shoots the 175 grain Hornady ELDX bullet at 2,770 feet per second out of it with an 18-inch long barrel. No, that's not a screaming velocity, but that is respectable performance, especially in a lightweight, compact package like that. Especially when you combine the outstanding accuracy he's getting out of that rifle with that performance too. So the 7 SAUM has remained somewhat popular in that realm, but is basically dead otherwise. Only Nosler and Remington make ammo for it, but this is really a great project for hand loaders. Remington used to make rifles for it. I think Fierce did too. Gunworks had in the past. And some of those are still floating out there. Or you can do kind of like what Mark did and just kind of do your own custom or semi-custom build and make one from scratch. Okay, that is enough with all those little short-action cartridges. That's all well and good, but let's talk about some serious big guns now. Next, we'll talk about the 7mm Remington Ultra Magnum. This cartridge was a part of their new Remington Ultra Magnum line of cartridges for the new millennium. They use a case either descended from or inspired by the 404 Jeffrey, so it's got that fatter, beltless case design. The 7mm Remington Ultra Magnum, or 7 RUM, is a very long cartridge, requires a full Magnum-length rifle action, 3.6 inches long case, has a slightly rebated rim, 65,000 psi SAAMI max average pressure. Uses a 1 9.5 inch twist barrel. This is a very flat-shooting, hard-hitting round. It was actually the fastest 7mm cartridge in the world at the time of its introduction. It uses a cavernous case, and you could push bullets really fast going out of that thing. Factory loads are very fast, and you can make some fast hand loads. So going back to what I was talking about earlier with the 7mm shooting times Westerner, if you take that Nosler hand load with a 120 grain ballistic tip with the 7 RUM, put 102 grains of powder in it, you'll get a muzzle velocity of over 3,700 feet per second. That requires nearly 10 grains more powder for less than 100 additional feet per second of velocity, though. This is a very inefficient, very overbore cartridge. It's actually the smallest caliber of all of the Remington Ultra Magnums. They also made a 300, a 338, and a 375 RUM. This goes back to the concept I've talked about in the past of more is more. Right now, Barnes, Remington, and Nosler make ammo for the cartridge. You can get a load with 150 grain core lock at 3230 for almost 3,500 foot-pounds of energy, 150 grain Sirocco at 3325 for nearly 3,700 foot-pounds of energy, 145 grain Barnes LRX at 3350 for just over 3,600 foot-pounds of energy, 160 grain AccuBond at 3225 feet per second, or a 175 grain AccuBond long range at just over 3,040 feet per second. Once again, very flat shooting cartridge. That 150 grain Sirocco has 29.2 inches of drop at 500 yards. That's pretty darn impressive to get under 30 inches like that with a 200 yard zero. If you take that 120 grain ballistic tip hand load I was telling you about earlier, 3,700 feet per second muzzle velocity, do a 300 yard zero with it, you get just 18 inches of drop at 500 yards. The downsides of this cartridge, like I said, very inefficient. You need a lot of powder to get that velocity. That means you also need a really long barrel for ideal performance. 24-inch barrel is kind of short for this cartridge. 26, 28-inch long barrels seem to do a lot better. You also get more recoil, lots of muzzle blast with this too. Ammo is also very expensive. Recoil is stout, but not terrible. Recoil probably more or less on par with a 338 Win Mag and a 9-pound rifle with that 120 grain ballistic tip at 3,700 feet per second I just mentioned. So this cartridge is great for all the things that you would normally hunt with a 7mm cartridge. Deer, antelope, bear, hogs, elk, moose. The thing that you get with a really high velocity round like this is a flatter cartridge, better performance at long range. But this isn't necessarily the sort of cartridge you'd want to take on a mountain hunt, for instance, where you need a lighter weight rifle. Because you need that longer barrel for optimum performance with it, and you also need just a little bit heavier rifle to keep recoil more manageable with it. You start cutting down the barrel, you lose a lot of velocity, you cut down on the weight, recoil really goes up. So that kind of limited the appeal of this cartridge. There were certainly plenty of people that wanted to use it in a more conventional sense, but the performance gain that you get with the 7 RUM versus, say, a 7mm Remington Magnum in those cases, Yeah, it performs more, but I don't know that it's enough to justify the headaches associated with the cartridge. So with all of these things in mind, this is another one of those rounds that just seems to be on its way out. I don't think it was super duper popular to begin with, but two newer rounds have really shown at the door more recently. Now, one of those rounds is the 28 Nosler. As I record this, the lineup of Nosler cartridges includes the 22 Nosler, introduced in 2017, the 26 Nosler, introduced in 2013, the 27 Nosler, introduced in 2020, the 28 Nosler, introduced in 2015, the 30 Nosler, introduced in 2016, and the 33 Nosler, which was also introduced in 2016. All of those cartridges, with the exception of the 22 Nosler, utilize a 404 Jeffrey case that is shortened and necked down to the caliber designated by the two digits in the name of the cartridge. So the 28 Nosler is necked down to 284 caliber, or 7 millimeter. The 28 Nosler fits in a standard 30-06 length action. Now, the 26, 27, 28, 30, and 33 Nosler cartridges all feature a factory load with the new Nosler AccuBond long-range bullet. That bullet came out in 2013. That bullet was right on the leading edge of a new trend with higher BC projectiles. It was actually one of the first, if not the first, purpose-built hunting bullet made by a major company designed for use at extended range. And this bullet actually came out before the Hornady ELDX. Nosler currently makes 6 factory loads for the 28 Nosler. 5 of those are appropriate for hunting. You got 150 grain E-tip at 3250. That's actually faster than the 140 grain AccuBond out of a 7 millimeter rim mag. You have 160 grain AccuBond at 3300, a 160 grain partition at 3250, 160 grain ballistic tip at 3200, and a 175 grain AccuBond long range at 3,215 feet per second. That last one is delivering a muzzle energy just shy of 3,800 foot-pounds. That 175 grain AccuBond long range is really the premier flagship load for the 28 Nosler. Hornady also offers 28 Nosler ammo in the Precision Hunter line with a 162 grain ELDX. Muzzle velocity 3,175 feet per second. That's 125 feet per second faster than their 7 STW load, 175 feet per second faster than their 7 millimeter Winchester short mag load, and 200 feet per second faster than their 7 millimeter Remington Magnum load. So the 28 Nosler actually slightly exceeds the 7 millimeter RUM in performance, but does so in a standard action instead of that longer Magnum action the 7 RUM requires. Now, the 28 Nosler is by far the most popular Nosler cartridge. You got the Nosler ammo I just talked about. You got the Hornady ammo I just talked about. It's available in the Federal Terminal Ascent line. It's available from Weatherby in some of their ammo, and Barnes also makes factory ammo for it too. Nosler makes rifles for the 28 Nosler. Christensen Arms makes rifles in this chambering, both their Mesa and Ridge line. Fierce makes rifles in this chambering. You can get it in the Savage 110, the Weatherby 307, Browning X-Bolt, the Bergara Mountain 2.0, and Premier Canyon. Sequence Precision also makes rifles in this chambering. So it's a pretty popular cartridge that's available in a pretty good variety of factory loads and rifles. Ammo isn't cheap, but not terrible either. Same thing with recoil, stout but manageable. This really seems to be the best balanced of all of the Nosler cartridge. 28 Nosler delivers wonderful performance at extended range because it has enough velocity, but it also works well with those higher BC bullets, like that 175 grain AccuBond long range. While the 7 RUM has a 1 and 9.5 inch SAAMI spec rifling twist rate, the 28 Nosler has a little bit faster 1 and 9 inch SAAMI standard twist rate. It's very flat shooting. It performs well in the wind. It retains energy and velocity extremely well downrange. Not nearly as overbore as the 7 RUM. It actually gets better velocity using less powder. I would not say the 28 Nosler is an efficient cartridge, but it is certainly more efficient than the 7 RUM. Wonderful choice for an open country hunt. And that's why it has really taken over that part of the hunting market. And it was really the dominant player there for a long time. But Things are changing on that front, and there is a new cartridge that is giving the 28 Nosler a run for its money. That is Hornady's 7mm precision rifle cartridge, released in 2023. Now, I get accused of playing favorites all of the time. Any cartridge comparison I do, people will accuse me of bias in favor of one cartridge or another in it because it is my favorite. I'll tell you, most of the time those critics are wrong, but I'll be brutally honest with you right now. The 7mm PRC is my favorite rifle cartridge. Now, Hornady built this new 7mm cartridge specifically designed to use very long, high BC bullets using a neck-down 375 Ruger cartridge as a parent case. Typical 7 PRC ballistics are that 175 grain bullet at 3,000 feet per second or a 180 grain bullet at 2950. Both loads use long, aerodynamic, heavy for caliber projectiles that minimize bullet drop and wind drift at extended range. For instance, the Hornady 175 grain ELDX bullet that they offer in a factory load for this cartridge has a .689 BC. Their 180 grain ELD match bullet has a ridiculous .796 BC. Now you compare that to something like 160 grain Accubon with a .531 BC. That's not a bad bullet at all, but massive difference comparing that bullet to those two heavier Hornady bullets. Now, the 175 grain Nosler Accubon long range does come closer, .648 BC, still falls a little short. Now, you do need a fast rifling twist to stabilize those really aerodynamic bullets, though. Now, like I just mentioned, 28 Nosler has a 1 and 9 inch twist rate. 7 SAUM has a 1 and 9.25 inch twist rate. 7 RUM has a 1 and 9.5 inch twist rate. Same with the 7 WSM and the 280 Ackley. 7mm STW has a 1 and 10 inch twist rate. 7mm Rim Mag has a SAAMI spec twist rate of 1 and 9.5, though you can find both faster and slower twist rates with that cartridge. Well, the 7mm PRC uses a 1 and 8 inch twist rate to stabilize those really long, heavy, high BC bullets. Plus, the 7mm PRC uses a much more modern overall cartridge design than those other cartridges as well. Now, John Snow wrote a great article on this subject for Outdoor Life. Just do an internet search for modern cartridge design, probably come right up. Long story short, companies designing new cartridges these days typically employ some of these design principles that incorporate best practices obtained from competition and bench rest shooters to obtain the best possible accuracy. In addition to that faster twist rate, cartridges designed using these principles have cases with a long enough neck to support those longer, high BC bullets. They can seat those really long bullets to the SAAMI specified max overall length without intruding into the powder column. They employ minimal body taper. They headspace off sharp shoulders, and they have a chamber design with a snug throat. Taken together, all of these principles result in cartridges with a very high degree of accuracy potential, especially at extended range. Well, the 7mm precision rifle cartridge design incorporates all of those principles. The end result is the 7mm PRC is optimized to very accurately shoot those long, sleek, high BC bullets at Magnum velocities and to deliver outstanding accuracy in the process with factory rifles, factory ammo. Now, before we talk any more about the 7mm PRC, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the fact that some of the current production, as of late 2024 anyway, Hornady factory loads for the cartridge not reaching their advertised velocity. Hornady advertises 3,000 feet per second with a 175 grain ELDX bullet. Depending on your rifle, current factory loads may be giving you 2,800, 2,850 feet per second with that bullet. Not bad, but still quite a bit slower than what they advertise. I have done an entire episode discussing this problem and what I think is going on in detail. So I would ask you to check out that episode in the video description or the show notes. But long story short, they're having some powder availability problems, but Federal makes a factory load for the 7 PRC with the same bullet. Their ammo uses a different powder, and it is delivering velocities almost exactly as advertised out of my rifle. So yes, the 7mm PRC can achieve that performance. It'll achieve it with the Federal ammo. It'll achieve it with the older Hornady factory ammo. You can also get there if you hand load. And hopefully in the near future, Hornady factory loads will be achieving this velocity again, and the controversy will have disappeared. Now, I can hear what some people may be thinking or saying right now. But John, the 28 Nosler is faster. Well, you're right. It's not just about velocity, though. So let's dive into things a little bit more. Now, the 28 Nosler is indeed a little bit faster with a bullet that's not quite as aerodynamic as the 175 grain ELDX. So let's do a comparison here. We'll also throw in that 120 grain ballistic tip load for the 28 Nosler just to see how that super fast load performs. So you can take a 28 Nosler, hand load it with 120 grain ballistic tips and reach darn near 3,800 feet per second. That'll give you 23.8 inches of drop at 500 yards, 15 inches of wind deflection, 1,779 foot-pounds of retained energy at that range, 27 foot-pounds of recoil energy. Same cartridge, 175 grain AccuBond long range, muzzle velocity 3,125 feet per second. You'll get 31.7 inches of drop at 500, 11.7 inches of wind deflection, 2,267 foot-pounds of retained energy, 31 foot-pounds of recoil. Take the 175 grain ELDX for the 7PRC. You'll get 34.2 inches of drop at 500, 11.6 inches of wind deflection at that range, 2,141 foot-pounds of retained energy, and 26 foot-pounds of recoil energy. So the 7PRC is neck and neck with the 175 grain load for the 28 Nosler in terms of the wind. It's a little bit behind in energy, a little bit behind in its trajectory, a little bit more arcing trajectory. Now, the 120 grain ballistic tip is easily the flattest of all of these loads, but it does not do nearly as well in the wind. Now, interestingly, the 7PRC has the least recoil of all three of these cartridges, and it also retains more energy than the 120 grain ballistic tip, quite a bit more energy than the 120 grain ballistic tip at 500 yards, too. Why? It's because it uses that more efficient, higher BC bullet. Now remember, that's the 7PRC versus the 28 Nosler. 28 Nosler is a fantastic cartridge, and that's really the only real competition in this area to the 7PRC in the 7mm realm anyway, with factory ammo. Plus, there's also an argument to be made that, on average, the 7mm PRC will be more accurate with factory rifles and with factory ammo too than the Nosler cartridge. That's not to say the other cartridges can't be more accurate on an individual level or that a savvy gun owner can't tune their specific 7mm Magnum to achieve even better accuracy. It's just with off-the-shelf rifles and ammo, on average, the 7PRC will win. I've shot two different 7PRC rifles from two different manufacturers extensively, and they both shoot great. And they do so with a wide variety of different types of ammo. This has become an extremely popular cartridge in a very short period of time. It just took off into the stratosphere in terms of popularity right out of the get-go as soon as Hornady released it. Hornady was the only company that made ammo for it to start, but things have changed quickly. Nosler has picked it up. They also offer a load for the 7PRC with the 175 grain AccuBond long range. Same with Remington. They make ammo for it too. Federal offers ammo for it with that 175 grain ELDX in the Federal Premium line. They also offer two different loads in their terminal ascent line, 155 grain and 170 grain terminal ascent. Barnes now makes ammo for it too with 160 grain LRX. Weatherby also makes ammo for the cartridge as well now too. Among other loads, they make a load with a hammer bullet. That's an interesting concept too. Lots of rifle options as well. Bergara, Browning, Christensen Arms, CVA, Fierce, Mossberg, Remington, Ruger, Savage, Seekins, Springfield, Weatherby. I'm sure I'm leaving out some other companies there too. But once again, brand new cartridge, lots of rifle, lots of ammo options right out of the gate. This is a great all-around cartridge. So that is one of the reasons why I just like it so much. As I record this, I have taken game with the Hornady 160 grain CX bullet, the Hornady 175 grain ELDX bullet, the Nosler 175 grain AccuBond long range bullet, and the Federal 170 grain terminal ascent bullet. I used that terminal ascent load for my moose early this year. I took a mule deer in 2023, along with a couple species of African plains game with the CX bullet. I took a real nice axis deer with the Nosler Accubon long range, took a black buck with the ELDX, and I'm still working my way through all these other different types of ammo. With luck, I'll take that new... Oh, I also forgot, Federal also offers the 7PRC in their tipped fusion line as well. So with luck, I'll be taking a deer or something with that tipped fusion ammo and the hammer bullet from Weatherby and the new Remington load and all of that stuff. So lots of great options. They all seem to work really well for all the sort of things that you would use a 7mm cartridge on. So that is my personal favorite 7mm cartridge. It's also my just favorite cartridge in general as well. You're welcome to disagree with me. Totally fine. Not a darn thing wrong if you like a 28 Nosler or a 7 Rim Mag or whatever. It really, like I mentioned, most of those cartridges, especially say you separate the Magnums out from the other ones, they're offering similar performance to each other. There's not a tremendous difference between the various 7mm Magnums. And the same is really true with the quote-unquote standard cartridges and the short-action cartridges. All of these cartridges are great for deer size game. And for the most part, you could argue about maybe the 730 Waters or something like that. But for the most part, these cartridges are good for bigger game as well. And we can quibble about this cartridge maybe being a little bit better than that cartridge for this or that. And sure, some of them are higher velocity cartridges and or use a higher BC bullet that is better at longer range than the others. But it's a lot of differences just kind of around the edges and differences in how these different cartridges get to those similar destinations more than anything else. It's not like one of them is great for elk and the other ones are terrible for it. No, there's just a lot of overlap in their capabilities. So if we step back from all of these cartridges and just look at them as a group, it's interesting. Remington really owns this space. They have the 7mm 08, the 7 SAUM, the 280, the 7 Rim Mag, the 7mm Remington Ultra Magnum. They were also the company that did the heavy lifting to get the 7 STW across the finish line with SAAMI as well. So 6 of these cartridges bear the Remington name. Nosler, of course, took up the mantle of the 28 Nosler. They also got the 280 Ackley SAAMI certified. The 284 Winchester by Winchester, the 7 PRC by Hornady, the 7 Weatherby by Weatherby, 730 Waters by Federal. We have a lot of European influence here with the 7x64, kind of with the 761, even though there was 2 Americans that designed it. They did most of the work getting it across the finish line in Europe. And of course, we have the legendary 7x57 Mauser. So I'm not quite sure what the future holds for the 7mm bore diameter. Sort of like I described in my 33 cal episode, it seems like the advent of better quality bullets has hurt those bigger bore cartridges like 338 caliber in particular, but that has resulted in increased popularity of some of these smaller diameters to include the 7mm bore size. Now, guys like Craig Boddington and Art Alphen didn't exactly deride the 7mm in their writings on those cartridges, but they definitely seem to prefer bigger rounds for bigger game, especially elk. Now, some people, of course, still feel that way, but there seems to be a general trend towards using smaller stuff in general right now. That has certainly helped the 7mm bore diameter, but it's also possible that trend will continue, and we may see a continued adoption of even smaller calibers at the expense of the 7mm bore size in the future. Now, like Yogi Berra said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. So check back with me in a couple years. We'll see what things look like on the 7mm front. But right now, we have a pretty solid cast of cartridges that do darn near anything you would want to reasonably do with the 7mm anyway. I don't see a screaming need for anything new in this space right now, but it's very possible that someone will surprise me in the near future and we'll see a new 7mm something, 7mm whiz bang, whatever. So stay tuned for more details. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, be sure to check out my 30 caliber episode, 286, my 270 cal episode, episode 291, my 9.3 and 3.75 caliber episode, 297, 40 and 50 cal episodes with Kevin Robertson, that's 300 and 329, my 25 cal episode, 328, and my more recent 33 caliber episode, which is episode 338. Don't worry, others along those lines are coming in the future for stuff like, say, 22 cal, 6mm, 6.5 millimeter, etc. Drop me a line, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com. Send any feedback you have on this episode or what you want to hear from me in the future. Now, I would also like to extend an invitation to you to join the community I'm building on Patreon at patreon.com/biggamehunter, or click the link in the show notes. I will be doing another Q&A session before the end of the year. I'll do a couple more each year in the future as well. I'll also share the results of some ballistic gel tests and ammo comparisons, stuff like that, exclusively with my Patreon supporters. I also prioritize correspondence with my Patreon supporters before anyone else. Anyone can email me with questions. Patreon supporters get priority with that stuff. I also offer some other cool bonuses to supporters as well, so check out the links in the show notes and learn more. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.